Thank you for everyone joining the public presentation of the preliminary annual budget. We on a beautiful evening. It's I appreciate that everyone has taken the time to learn a little bit about the district budget process and what we are predicting at this point for our annual budget for the fall of 21-22. So I wanted to start by acknowledging that the Board of Education acknowledges that we're on the traditional territories of the Comox First Nation, and we would like to thank them for the privilege of living on their land and the gift of working with their children. And so it's the budget process is an important process for the district. It's the process that we use to link resources to the strategic plan and the district initiatives. And it's an annual cycle that we go through that starts with estimating what our enrollments are going to be for the following school year. And then from those initial enrollment estimates, we determine, the Ministry of Education determines what our funding envelope will look like. And then we start going from there. Once we have the estimated funding announcement, planning our staffing and our other expenses attached to those revenues. So this is an early stage in our budget process, but we wanted to have a public presentation of where we are in the budget process. And really, we wanted to reassure the staff and students of SD 71 that we're in a very good financial situation in the district. The district has worked very hard in past years to make sure that our revenues match our expenses and we're not in a structural deficit. Some other districts have been in the news recently with predicting significant overspends and having to cut programs and staff and costs. And, you know, we are not in that situation. We don't anticipate being in that situation. And so we just wanted to share that information with the public. And so currently in the timeline, we're just in the early stages of gathering our information. We'll present a draft budget to the Board of Education, hopefully at the May board meeting, which is May 25th. And you know, we're confident that we'll be able to present a balanced budget that will neither have significant enhancements, but it also won't be a significant draw on the reserves that the district has. So that we felt that was a very good news story that we wanted to share with everyone. So I have a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation that I'll share and go through. And then at the end of the presentation, there is an email address. If anyone in the public is interested and wants further information, then they can send us an email and we'll be glad to answer the questions. So I'm just going to share my screen. Sorry. And I've got the budget presentation. So can you see my slideshow? Okay, great. So I'm just going to start with a little overview of the budget cycle and the process, and then I'll get into the more specific numbers of what we're looking at for the 21-22 school year. So overall, how the district is funded is predominantly from the Ministry of Education. So we receive about 97% of our funding from the Ministry of Education, both through operating grants and other ministry grants. We get a small amount of revenue from other revenue, tuition, rentals and leases, and investment income. And then we do have operating reserve that is recommended to be around 2%, 2.5% of your operating expenses to keep for contingencies. So, and you know, how do we spend our money? So the ministry asks districts to present their spending two different ways. So the same amount of expenses we present on our statements, both by salaries and benefits and service and supplies, and then also by function, which is broken up into education, district administration, operations and maintenance, and transportation. So when we take our expenses separated out by salaries and benefits, we see that about 69% of our expenses are salaries, another 17.5% are benefits, and then the rest is service and supplies. So in the 2021 annual budget, that was around 79 million of the total budget was spent on salaries and benefits, and around 14 million was spent on supplies and services. So the same amount of expenses shown in the four functions that the ministry also requests the expenses to be separated out by. So overall, the district spends 81, almost 82%. And this was again based on the 2021 annual budget of the expenses on instruction, just over 4% on administration, 11.8% on operations and maintenance, and 2.4% on transportation. And those numbers are very much in line with the provincial spending and how other districts allocate their resources. So we have overall operating revenues, operating expenses, and then we also have what's called special purpose funds. So that's funds we get from the Ministry of Education for specific targeted spending. So included in those are an annual facility grant, the Learning Improvement Fund for additional classroom supports, community links which support meal programs, etc., Strong Start and Ready Set Learn. So those are targeted funds for early learning initiatives in the district. We have federal French grants as well as the Classroom Enhancement Fund. So those are just an overview of some of the special purpose funds the district has. And then also the district does receive capital funds. So these are funds that we use to acquire land and buildings and or do renovations. And so then the capital funds, the other funds that we receive from the ministry are predominantly issued to districts based on per pupil funding, whereas capital funds are on a needs basis, and the district submits an annual 5-year capital plan with our capital plan requests, and then the ministry takes all of those, reviews them, and then decides within their capital funding envelope how many of the projects they can support. So overall, as I mentioned earlier, it's important for the district to connect the budget in with the strategic plan, and the 4 pillars of the SD71 strategic plan are educational excellence, community engagement, organizational stability, and environmental stewardship, and physical health and mental well-being. So it's important to be able to connect the resources to those goals set out by the Board of Education and the senior team. So as I mentioned also, our preliminary budget process is based on the enrollment projections that we submit to the ministry. In February of each year, we take our estimations of what our enrollments are going to look like for the following September and submit them into the ministry. And then in March, the ministry prepares the preliminary grant funding announcement. Then, as I mentioned, March through May, we do the preliminary budget development process, and it's a requirement of the School Act and the Ministry of Education that we submit a balanced budget. So if the situation is where expenses are exceeding revenues, then the district needs to apply reserves in order to balance the budget, but it must be a balanced budget. So, and then our timeline for this budget is to have a preliminary budget prepared for the board to consider at the May board meeting, but it must be submitted to the ministry no later than June 30th. So the factors in our current budget planning are making sure we set our priorities for the delivery of student learning, again, based on the strategic plan, determining, the ongoing effects of COVID and how we need to account for any particular impacts that we might be seeing. Again, the projections in student enrollment, which then drives the majority of our revenue. And we look at what our current costs for salary and benefits and utilities, service and supplies are for next year if we keep the budget at status quo. So if we roll over the budget, what would that cost us, considering what cost pressures there might be, salary increases or other cost pressures. And then, so that's the process of determining what costs might change or how they would be changed and estimating the impacts on the overall budget. And again, along with the Ministry of Education funding announcement, we do have other revenue streams, the international student fees, rental fees, interest income, and other grants that the ministry might announce. So we're trying to project all of those things and estimate. And this year we've been, very cognizant of the fact that we're still in the middle of a global pandemic and that there might be some impacts on education in the fall that we need to account for, and to be somewhat conservative in our estimations of both enrollments, because we don't know the full impacts, and also our corresponding expenses. So our prediction that we submitted to the ministry in February for enrollments was projected to be 9,271 students. And this is down a little bit from the 2021 year because we saw a significant increase in our enrollments in the middle of the global pandemic in our distance education program. So all indications are that there will be students will come back to regular school in the fall of 21-22, and that we'll see a decrease in families choosing alternative education sources and our distance education programs. So based on that initial preliminary announcement, we estimate our Ministry of Education revenues to be just over $94 million, which is an increase of $3.3 million. And then correspondingly, when enrollment increases and revenues increase, we also have an increase in costs. So and there's other impacts. We're estimating some impacts on other revenues due to COVID and a reduction in other areas. Our international education, our interest income is going to be down slightly, etc. So then, we take all that into consideration, and we feel that overall the revenues are going to increase just over $3 million. But as I mentioned, these are early predictions, and we'll have a finalized document ready for the board to consider hopefully in May. But then also there's the expenses that go along with that. So when we have increased enrollment in our schools, we also need increased staffing and other costs. We feel that we'll still be required to have some enhanced cleaning protocols, and we have some ongoing HVAC projects that we are working on. So the cost pressures will match what we were estimating as a revenue increase. But again, the good news is that we're predicting that those two will balance out. So based on those early estimates of enrollments and revenue and expenses, we do anticipate being able to present a balanced budget to the Board of Education. And that's based on the hard work that the trustees and senior staff have done over the past few years, making sure that the district is not in a structural deficit, and that our levels of staffing are appropriate to the services and the strategic directions in the strategic plan that the board provided. So this is really good news that we're not anticipating a significant deficit or a drawing down of reserves in order to balance our preliminary budget. And so then once we submit the preliminary budget in the June, by June 30th, then the next part of the budget cycle process is an amended budget. So, and this updated budget, so we take the preliminary budget that we're submitting to the ministry, and we update it based on the actual enrollment in the count of students at September 30th. And then we report the actual enrollment to the ministry by that on that date. Then by December 15th, they'll provide us a recalculated grant. So they update the revenue expenses. So for example, we're predicting 9,271 students. If we see 9,000 students, that means our revenue would be decreased, but then we would correspondingly in our amended budget adjust our expenses to match that. So every year we submit an amended budget to the ministry, and it must be submitted by February 28th. But already by that time, we've started our enrollment predictions for the following year. So prior to when the amended budget is due, we've already started the process for the next year, for the 22-23 year. So it's a constant cycle of assessing our revenues and expenses and making sure that we're prudent in our estimations and tracking our costs and making sure that the district is in a good fiscal situation and being fiscally responsible with the resources we're given. So once we do the amended budget, as I said, then the cycle starts again, and we'll be back at this time next year doing another public presentation on next year's budget. So, so this is the presentation that I had prepared. If there's questions or requests for information, then we have a email address that's on our website as well as on this presentation, which we will share on the website as well. And we will be glad to answer any questions that come in and interest that there is in the district budget process. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and we'll go back to the main meeting. So we have basically, that's the end of the presentation that I had prepared. I wasn't sure, I do have a question in the chat. Oh, so Josh has provided the link for the feedback in the chat function on the meeting. And I wasn't sure if the chair of our budget advisory committee or and I should have introduced the Director of Finance, Candace Hilton, at the start of the meeting, as well as we have Kathy Collins, who is our Finance Manager, attending as well. So they're very instrumental in helping prepare this information for the district and gathering all of the estimations that we have. So did you want to comment, Trustee Frawley?
No, I think I am good. You do a great job at explaining it. And everyone has the opportunity to put in their feedback or reach out for any questions or concerns they have. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who helped out.
Yes, and thank you for everyone that tuned in on such a beautiful night. So we will be preparing the draft document. It will be presented. The Budget Advisory Committee process ends May 11th. They have a final meeting for a wrap up of all of the information we've gathered. And then we'll start preparing a draft document for the board and for a conversation at the May 25th board meeting. So that will be when we'll have a draft document ready and we'll go from there. So
thank you.
Okay. So Thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and we look forward to having some questions submitted in through the district website.